Well, welcome to another episode of The Warrior's Walk. I'm here with my buddy Keith. I'm Todd, and today we're going to talk about why strong men seek help. So stay tuned. We got boats and we went out there, and we quickly realized it was a recovery mission, not a rescue. And what hit me at that time in my life, all three of my kids were pretty young, and there were just children everywhere, and not just intact either, like body parts. So I've noticed, in teammates that I've lost over the years, men will make a decision to take their life within 7 minutes. Like a bad conversation, a bad whatever, and within 7 minutes, they've done the deed. And I've lost track how many times I've met with somebody and said, I had dinner with him last night. Like he was good. Like I did check on him. And that morning he just woke up and it didn't work out. And the icebreaker question I asked, I said, hey, give me the ideal man. Like who's manly to you guys out there? And, but what was interesting after letting them ramble on for, say, 90 seconds, not one man said Jesus. And we've talked about
if you have 100 meaningful conversations about an incident in your past that was painful, it loses its power.
Mm-hmm.
That was pretty fascinating.
He said, if you practice gratitude every day, like you write 3 things down that you're thankful for, most of you will not need to see me or take medicine. But I think what reality's taught me, and even what the SEAL teams taught me, like the SEAL teams are not designed for the lone wolf. They're not designed for you to do anything solo. You want to be competent and you want to be able to do your job, but there's a reason why it's called teams.
Now, Todd, you are a retired Navy SEAL turned pastor, and you've been around a lot of tough guys. And even just being around you physically sometimes can be intimidating. When the injuries that you share with me, I'm like, I can't complain that I just got a boo-boo on my finger. And so there's a stigma around, just being physically tough, of course, like around people that have experienced some pretty significant, war stories and pain. But today we're going to be talking about why strong men actually seek help when it comes to counseling or even vulnerability. And that seems to be counterintuitive to being masculine or manly, to not show weakness or to feel like you need to get help. But that's a little bit different from your perspective, even just being a SEAL and just the necessity of getting help. So would you mind just sharing a little bit of your story about maybe just and we'll get into like some differences of different types of counseling and just even just some practical tips, for men out there that might be struggling but reluctant to talk about some of the struggles or talk about things that they've experienced in the past to get some guidance in that. So tell us a little bit about your story and how that might help other people that are watching or listening.
Sure. Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to mind is just culture. There's a culture in America, and certainly, it's pervasive in other places around the world, but to give you an example of just how palpable it was to me on how culture influences men in the church, let alone the world, I did a men's conference when I first started on staff, and 1,200 men show up for Saturday morning for, good old-fashioned Bible conference on manhood and all that, and the icebreaker question I asked, I said, hey, give me the ideal man, like who's manly to you guys out there? And, depending on the generation, some guys were like, John Wayne, and, Lee Marvin. And then the ages got younger. And of course, I didn't know who they were talking about. But what was interesting after letting them ramble on for, say, 90 seconds, not one man said Jesus. And we've talked about this in another podcast about those 2 attributes, how he was gentle and humble. Like that's the only thing he used to describe his heart, those 2 words. And so the culture that we see in the movies, the TV shows, and really even what's been passed down to many of us is that, if you're a man, you can figure it out and you'll do it on your own. But I think what reality's taught me, and even what the SEAL teams taught me, like the SEAL teams are not designed for the lone wolf. They're not designed for you to do anything solo. You want to be competent and you want to be able to do your job, but there's a reason why it's called teams. And so you need teammates. And so there's so many different times physically when you need help, where I remember one time we were doing winter warfare and, one of my buddies was not a very good skier and he just fell onto the snowbank and he had 200 pounds on his back. And if nobody was there, he would have died. Like he was upside down in a snowbank with 200 pounds on his back and 80 on his chest. And it was that would have been his end game right there. So, 2 of us grabbed him and pulled him out of the snowbank and off we went. So even physically we need help. But what I've learned is that mentally, and then even talking about pastorally, spiritually, there's seasons where we all need help. And I think the biggest step to the strength you and I are alluding to for those who are listening today is that first step is just to acknowledge, yeah, I need help. I need to talk to somebody.
Yeah.
And so from there, you can open up to all kinds of levels. Like you could talk to a friend, but then at some point, I think people need professional help. I went to 18 Delta, which is kind of like PA school on steroids. And so we got a little bit of mental health training there. And it was just evident that as I listen to counselors and as I listen to friends that that's their profession, I realized like they've normalized it to the point where it makes sense at some point we all would benefit from meeting with a counselor. And you and I talked about this before we shot this podcast, in that I think there's value in sitting with somebody that actually doesn't know you, where you can just like totally come clean. You're not getting judged. You're not going to carry over into your profession or your neighborhood, or you're not going to run into them at the grocery store. It's like, this person I'll probably never see again. I can say whatever I want.
Yeah.
And I think there's power in that.
Yeah. Now there's we talked about like the necessity, how, everybody could benefit from, counseling, talking through some of the things. How do you know if you need it? Like, do you wait until things just get absolutely because we see that there are people that get to a breaking point or desperation. They hit a rock bottom, so to speak. I mean, we see that, especially men, they're way more likely to commit suicide statistically. What are some of the stats even from the veteran community, on men that commit suicide?
Well, they kind of ebb and flow, but the average that is promoted is 22 a day.
22 a day, yeah.
Right? And so
we know that people are hurting in severe situations, of course, but some people are functional in their life too, and they can really benefit from it. So, I mean, what would be some guidelines on, when do you think you actually need it? Or I think there's like, when I talk to people about counseling, it's usually like, I don't know if I need to go see a counselor yet. Or, like where there's like a level of severity that they need to reach in their mind where they're like, okay, now I need to talk to someone about this. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, I think we can work this in levels. I mean, with the individual. So if you're listening today, I mean, I always tell people, if like, you don't apologize when you go to the doctor when your stomach hurts, or you broke your arm. Like, you go to the doctor because you want your arm fixed. And yet there's this stigma like, well, like I'm having these bad thoughts, and whether it's to this extreme of suicide, or you're just so down in the dumps and you're really having a hard time. But I would say first and foremost, like if you want to talk front sight focus, if you find yourself in the crazy cycle on your own where you just can't get out of it, and I would even say where you're up and down multiple times during a day, and you just like, I'm happy, I'm sad, and I just don't know what to do, that would be a good like bell ring saying you need help. And go get help. Now, I do agree, like sometimes you just need a good buddy to talk to, and there's value in that, just to have somebody listen to you. Because that's what a lot of great counselors do.
Sometimes like it's physical, right? Just like taking a nap or eating some food.
Yeah, or working out, hitting the punching bag, right?
Exercise can make a huge difference.
All those things. So there's tiers, but ultimately, if you're doing all those things, you're working out, and you got a buddy you're talking to, and you're getting plenty of sleep, and you're not self-medicating with pain meds or booze and all the other stuff that can really magnify some of these things and really take you down a scary path, then I would say that's time for you to get help. The other one that you want to notice is if you have a friend or family member that loves you and they suggest you get help.
Yeah, if they're concerned.
You really should listen to that too, because most people aren't going to just throw that out casually.
Yeah.
But like, man, I care about you. I think you should go get help. I think that's a big one too. And then ultimately, for the listener, if they're involved in a church, and the pastor that you meet with, say you meet with a pastor, I think that's a great first step for people that are involved in a church. And if you're pastor, and pastors, Keith and I know this, like we know when to turf people to the next level. Sometimes I'll be like, I think you actually need medical help. Like you might need an actual medication, for legit, maybe it's bipolar, depression, schizophrenia. Like there's a lot of things you could be experiencing because we live in a fallen world, and these parts of ours, our brains, they break down. And so you have that avenue as well. But I think when you look at yourself first and you're not able to figure it out, or if you got a friend that says you need help, or, a pastor's like, I recommend you go get counseling, all those I would say is God's kind direction saying it's time to get help.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't until, so there was actually a helpful thing. I just had a regular like checkup physical with my primary doctor, And there was just this thing where the doctor handed me a thing, and they were like, "Hey, I'm just gonna step out of the room. There's a checklist here. Just fill it out honestly." And then and as I was going through that checklist, I was like, "Oh my goodness!" Like some of these things are really like it, because it has like a range of like, okay, I struggle with these thoughts, or whatever, or like I'm feeling down, or all these different things, and it says like daily, frequently, or like sometimes or never. And I was like, there's a lot of like frequently on there, for some of these things for me. And I didn't even really, I was like, I could probably guess that things were just off, but it was that, that conversation with my doctor that kind of helped. And it was just grateful that it was like a requirement, or like a thing that they implemented just as a regular check-in every year with every patient. And so I said that kind of thing could be a good, just like kind of running through a checklist of, okay, how frequently these things, that you're thinking of, or if you're getting stuck in the same, cycle, like you mentioned, if it's like once a year, if it's once every so many years, whatever, like, okay, maybe not something that you need to seek professional help with, but if it's like, okay, daily, or, where you're in a rut and you just can't feel like, you're getting out of that, then sometimes, it just helps to have some outside help. Now, why do you think there is a stigma specifically with guys around not wanting to get help? Like where they might even see, yes, I really need help, but they won't go and get help.
Yeah. I don't think it's, we don't have to do a huge leap here to figure out why. I think men are wired to have a little bit of a, pride. And I mean, this whole ideal, since we were little boys, we're taught, the mantra to do something to get something. And this ideal of asking for help or admitting that you need help. And specifically on this topic, it's because, again, it's one thing you're like, if I go to somebody and say, hey, would you teach me how to swim better, or teach me how to run better, or lift better, or whatever, like there's guys do that pretty easy. Like they'll see someone who's doing really well at something, they want to get better, shooting, you name it, motorcycles. By the way, Keith loves motorcycles, if you didn't know that about Keith.
Old motorcycles too. Yeah.
Yeah. Old ones that don't work, and then he fixes them and sells them.
There you go.
Yeah. Beautiful things. But I think, so you have all those things. So we are prone to ask for stuff we desire, but then there's this stigma that's, I would say it's not near what it used to be, but I still think it's out there for a lot of men. And to be fair, there's some ladies that don't want to get help, but I say traditionally, what I've observed is women will go get help quicker, probably because they're smarter than us. But, and it's just,
you live longer. Yeah.
They live longer. And I mean, there's lots of memes on that too, on why, like they'll light a little firecracker and run away, and we like gasoline, right? But anyway, that kind of sidetracks the topic, but not really, because I think if you don't address these things, they do become gasoline, right? And they will explode on you.
Yeah.
And the other difference is I've noticed, in teammates that I've lost over the years, men will make a decision to take their life within 7 minutes, like a bad conversation, a bad whatever. And within 7 minutes, they've done the deed. And I've lost track how many times I've met with somebody and said, I had dinner with him last night. Like he was good. Like I did check on him. And that morning he just woke up and it didn't work out. So I just know pride's the biggest thing. And if you can learn to swallow your pride, and I would say, just so you don't think I have a giant finger pointing at all of you listeners, I myself this year went to counseling for the first time, and so I just like, you know what? I just feel like I'm off and some things aren't working. And so I got questions. So I went and saw a counselor.
Yeah. Which brings us to our next topic. So there's different types of counseling. Mm-hmm. So, and you experienced one particular kind that you were explaining to me, and I wasn't even aware of this and how it works, but it's called EMDR. That's right. And I'm going to put you on the spot. Do you remember what it stands for?
No.
I had to look it up too. So I had
brain injury, so I can say no.
So EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. I'm glad that they have abbreviation, because that's a mouthful.
Me too.
And so can you walk us through what that means? Like, what does it look like to have EMDR counseling? And is there certain types of people or certain, things that people would go through that would be the best type to approach counseling?
So the first exposure I had with EMDR was from a lady in our church. And so I got to meet with her and her husband, and she was one of the pioneers in it. And she explained, the lady who invented it was walking across campus. I'm just giving you a history lesson on this. And she was stressed out about something, but as she walked across campus, she'd see a bird off to her left. She saw a squirrel in a tree off to her right. And as she kept moving and shifting her gaze around, by the time she walked across the campus, she wasn't stressed out anymore. She's like, maybe I'm onto something here. And so she developed these devices that they do two things. They either blink lights in the left hand and the right hand, or they'll vibrate. And so the reason you want the vibrate function is someone like myself with TBI or someone that has extreme migraines, the lights can trigger that. So you take the devices from your counselor and you just slide them underneath your thighs, and then they control the pace in which they vibrate, and it kind of helps detach what's going on. So that's what's going on with EMDR. But what's cool is EMDR allows somebody to unpack some really painful memories, and they can look at it detached. So a couple steps that I forgot to mention here is the first thing, maybe the first 2 sessions, they spend time just getting you to be comfortable with them. They help you develop a safe place. And so go figure, mine, and I won't tell you where it's at exactly in Alaska, but like I developed this own cabin,
Yeah.
I had this cabin in Alaska, and it was on Sneaky Beach, and it was this beautiful place. And then I had a lift up floor where my secret armory was at. Again, not telling you where it's at, but as I went down in there, then I had this special box that I had the painful memories that I could put in. And so when we started doing EMDR, then I chose when to pull those memories out, because I had them under lock and key. And so I could pull them out. And what I learned is that you can look at things that are painful from the past, but you're detached enough that it doesn't trigger an emotional response. So your physiology doesn't change, your heart rate doesn't go up. And if it does, that's where a professional counselor is there, because a lot of times you have your eyes closed and you're talking about these things. And if they notice your heart rate going up or your breathing rate changes, then they'll bring you back to your safe place. And then maybe that's enough for the day. Oh. So as they keep exposing you to those thoughts and those memories, eventually you get desensitized to them where you can actually discuss them. And the one example that was given to me, and I think it's, this isn't breaking any confidence, but the one example that was given to me was so powerful. And then I realized, and I shared it with my wife, I said, I think any man or woman would benefit from EMDR counseling. But a woman, her husband was a jet setter, he traveled on both coasts, and he wanted his wife to be able to fly with him. But she could only do it if she was extremely liquored up or medicated with some really strong pills. And she usually made a fool of herself on the flight. Mm-hmm. And she's like, this has got to change. Like, I want to be supportive and travel with my husband, but I can't do it. So they spent like 2 or 3 visits. And then when they started doing the EMDR, she just started doing, story about her life. And she remembered when she was 14, I think that's the age that was given to me. She was on a cross-country trip with her stepdad. And the first night they stopped in a hotel and he tried to sleep with her. Well, then she carries on with the conversation like she's just moving on, but she's like, but she just keeps talking. And they traveled cross country on a motorcycle, and this behavior continued all the way till she returned home safely. So the plane represented being in an environment that she couldn't get out of. And so it triggered all those things, but she had buried it so deep, she completely forgot about it. I
don't even know why, yeah.
Completely forgot about it, which I know from experience, you can really forget about some painful things.
Yeah.
And so she gave her tools to deal with it. And then she called her a couple weeks later, and she was in LA, and she's like, I didn't take a pill. I didn't drink anything. Thank you so much. Like, you gave me my life back. And so that's an example of how EMDR works.
Yeah.
It's very powerful, and it helps so many veterans with PTSD, but also helps so many other men and women, from anxiety to you put the list out there and it helps. So it's EMDR, I think, is my go-to for recommendation for people because it's just so good.
Yeah. Now there's that's one type of counseling that you've benefited from, and even just hearing your experience with that, I'm like, man, I should probably go try that too.
I think anybody should.
Everybody should.
It's good.
And so this next one is a lot more common or unofficial, so to speak, and it's talk therapy.
Correct.
And this is like just discussing some things, and it could be with a community or a group of friends that are trusted, or a particular friend, or going to see a therapist or a counselor that can kind of navigate you through conversations and stuff. But you said something that I thought was pretty fascinating before we started recording, that if you have 100 meaningful conversations about an incident in your past that was painful, it loses its power.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was pretty fascinating. And so talk to us about that. Like, what can that look like for the average person? Like, does it have to be where you have to go lay down on the couch and talk about your feelings, which I think that's the stereotype of, where it's like, and also counseling, to some can be very expensive. And so,
yes.
So talk about the talk therapy, like what is the range there? Like, from just a simple conversation with someone that you love and trust versus like going to talk to someone more in depth about some of the things you're wrestling with.
Yeah, so it could start off like I'll just use a real world example. In 2000, I was involved in what I thought was a rescue mission, and so we were told that a plane went down and there were survivors, and it like had a basically controlled landing. And so I was on the USS Washington, and so I grabbed a bunch of young kids because all my platoon guys were out training, and I was there for all the grown up meetings. So I grabbed, all these young kids, and we got boats and we went out there, and we quickly realized it was a recovery mission, not a rescue. And what hit me at that time in my life, all three of my kids were pretty young, and there were just children everywhere, and not just intact either, like body parts. So I won't go into any more details just in case, just would just totally freak someone out listening. But it was really hard, and it was extremely hard for these 18 and 19-year-olds that are out there with me. I mean, I'm a grown man, and I've been pretty well trained at this point in my life. But I was really feeling for these 18 and 19-year-olds that just out of high school, and they're seeing body parts rolling around in a boat in the middle of the night. It's 110 degrees out there, or probably warmer, and the water temp was over 100. It was a hard 24 hours to recover all these bodies. Well, immediately when we got back, I just circled them all up. Like I didn't let them go anywhere, and we all sat down and we talked. I was like, let's talk about it. And that was step one. And then as I shared with you, it took me 10 years of sharing what I experienced before I stopped getting sick to my stomach and all those smells coming back to me every time I flew. And I flew a lot as a SEAL, and so it was really hard. But what I learned is it does, you can read it in a textbook, but it's different when you experience yourself, that as you share, it does lose its power over you. And I think there's, some great biblical lessons there too. A lot of other things we need to speak truth into our life. But I think the talk therapy in itself is just that, like a professional counselor they know how to ask a question and just give you space to talk. And a lot of times what's beautiful about a counselor also is they can connect some dots that you're not able to do on your own. And so I would say maybe money is tight. Maybe your insurance doesn't cover, you don't have insurance, and you're just like, I can't afford $190 or $200 an hour or whatever they cost, and it is expensive. That's the only way I went, it was like, insurance covered it. But you could start with, just sharing with a friend, and talking, someone that you trust, of course. You don't want to numbskull, and go to them because they could actually sabotage you and do worse. So you want to make sure you got a decent friend you're talking with. But then there is those circles where, maybe you have a decent pastor in your church and you can go talk to them. And all those are free as far as I know. And so Keith and I are free. We come at a very reasonable rate. We're free. But you get what you pay for sometimes too. But at some point, again, that's where you and we know when to turf somebody to another level and say, you really need to meet with a pro because this is complicated. You got a lot going on. So EMDR and talk therapy are, two of the more profound ones out there that get a lot of traction, and they do a lot of great things for people.
Yeah. Well, and I also, want to acknowledge, obviously, this is talking with other people, even some professionals, but don't underestimate the power of God's word, to, get alone with the Lord and express that, or journaling, just, writing your feelings down, writing what you're thinking.
Well, before you leave that too, one of the psychotherapists out there that worked for the Army and helped put together this GRIT program that's pretty, not notorious, but well-known in the Army, he said, here's a dirty little secret about psychotherapy, and he's a psychiatrist. And if you don't know the difference between, a psychologist and a psychiatrist is an MD, and they can actually write a prescription and give you medicine. And he said, if you practice gratitude every day, you write 3 things down that you're thankful for, most of you will not need to see me or take medicine. Now, to be fair, there are some people that will need to be on medicine for life. So this isn't declarative. Please hear me on that. So you'll listen to this podcast and say, I'm just going to write down.
Yeah, just be grateful. Yeah.
3 thank yous and I'll stop taking my meds. Listen, if you have schizophrenia, if you have bipolar, stay on your meds. And prayerfully, one day you can get off of them, but you don't want to stop any of those meds without consulting with your doctor. And then I would say another thing, just that I've experienced as a pastor, if your healthcare provider changes your meds, if you're on any kind of meds for depression, any kind of psychosis, make sure somebody knows your meds have changed and let them watch you. Some people, sometimes psychiatrists ramp up the meds too quickly, in my opinion, or they drop them too quickly, and that causes people to become suicidal. So you want to make sure you have a baseline and somebody knows you're changing your meds, because they're going to recognize it before you, because all you're going to do is be instinctive and respond to how you're feeling, and you can make a permanent solution to a temporary problem.
Yep. Well, I think there was two other questions I wanted to get your take on. So one, wanted to ask about just the benefits of going to see a pastor, a trusted pastor, how that could be like a next step for some people, especially if they don't, have the means to go see a professional counselor, or some pastors are professional. I mean, some of them have training in biblical counseling. And so, so what are some of the pluses or the benefits that just talking to your local church pastor can help you with?
A couple that come to mind is, one, prayerfully you already have a relationship with your pastor. If not, it's a great way to establish one. And this is somebody like, Keith and I know, like, according to God's word, we have a responsibility to shepherd the people under our care. And this is a way that a pastor can shepherd you and care for you. And so I love it when people are transparent with me, and I hold that very confident. I'm not going to be sharing any of that stuff. And then just so you know too, if you're listening and this is an unfamiliar topic, Keith and I, just like a school teacher, are mandatory reporters. So there are some things, if you share in counseling, that then the pastor's obligated to notify authorities. So just keep that in mind. And I don't say that to discourage you, but I want you to be informed. So if you go in and say,
by the way, that's a very, very small percentage of people that we talk with. So
very
it's not
small.
It's like, this is an everyday occurrence, or we have
no.
Like that. Most of the stuff that we talk to people about are very manageable things that.
Well, and like, here's an extreme example. Let's say you're feeling really guilty because you committed a horrible crime. And you go to your pastor and you're like, hey, I just need to get this off my chest. And he's like, just a second, let me call 911. You're like, why you call 911? Because you murdered somebody. So there are thresholds, of course. And I don't say that lightly to make fun of that. It's just, be aware. Yeah. But for the most part, it's a beautiful way where you have ongoing care, where then your pastor knows you, he knows how to pray for you. And again, like Keith said, don't underestimate God's word and prayer. And so to have someone you trust who can pray for you specifically about things is so valuable. And that's why Keith and I, it's so important that we have people pouring into us. You don't get an alibi because you're a pastor and all of a sudden you're like, go forth and make disciples, unless you're a pastor. It's like, we got to make disciples and we need to be discipled ourselves. Yeah. So we need that person to care for us. And so, there's so many good things I would recommend about, going to see your pastor. And then ultimately, it is trust. And there are times where people just don't sync up. Every once in a while you're like, and thankfully, we're in a big church. And so, if they don't sync up with you, maybe they sync up with me. And if they don't sync up with us, then we got another pastor we can refer them to. So it's nice to have multiple levels of care where you can hand people off, because sometimes people just don't sync up.
Well, I think the benefit too is, oftentimes, we as pastors, we meet with different people, and I think the question that comes up a lot, at least maybe it's just with parents of teenagers that I meet with, a lot of times the question is what I'm experiencing normal? Or what is what I'm thinking through am I the only one? And I would say the vast majority it's never unique. It's no. and I think there's comfort in that, because you have the common denominator of someone that's that's meeting with lots of people that they've actually met with other people, maybe with similar issues. They're not going to share that, share individual details, or because of confidentiality and all that stuff. But when it comes to that, I think a lot of times it's comforting to talk with someone and you're like, this is actually a common problem.
Yeah.
Well, that's really
sure.
I had no idea. And it's actually comforting to know that you're not the only one that's going through this process, what's helpful for me. So being in the youth ministry for so long, I've seen lots of different teenagers. So I have the cumulative knowledge of 20 years of youth ministry that I could say this is normal for all the teens that I come in contact. This is a very regular occurrence, and they're like, really, I thought my teenager was the only one or the first one to ever experience this or to cause this in my family, or and so so I think that's a benefit of seeing meeting with someone that also shepherds other people is just seeing that it's probably pretty common, the issue that you're going through.
For sure. Well, just like you highlighted teens, I can highlight marriages. You've been meeting with lots of marriages, been married for a long time myself. And, just off the top of my head, I would say that the top 3 things that bring people in the office are money, sex, and communication. Like one of those isn't working, and that brings them into the office. Yep. And you see their shoulders drop when you're like, believe it or not, this is pretty common. They're like, what? We thought we're the only ones who've ever discovered, that libido doesn't match. Now we're angry with each other. It's like, no, like get in line. It's like, it's very common.
Yeah. Now the other question, and speaking of marriages, so there might be people that only open up to their spouse, and what is your take on that? Do you think it's wise to to share things like with other trusted friends or other people in the family? Like I remember, in case in point, so when Caroline and I got married, we had a policy where it's like if we're struggling in our marriage, we're not going to go run to our family.
Very wise.
And just to kind of keep that, but at the same time, we would obviously go to other people that we trust and love, but what is your recommendation of that? Like, should it, or is it healthy if you're only sharing, in the context of your spouse or marriage?
Yeah. So it's a specific question to a big topic.
Yeah.
And so
on the issue.
I'll be careful not to be declarative there, but I totally agree with what you said as far as, young married couple, or it doesn't matter how long you've been married, like to run off to mom and dad is just asking for trouble. Because here's the scenario I do in premarital counseling. I'll say, you and Caroline are sitting there, and if I'm doing your premarital counseling, back in the day, and it's like, listen, like, Caroline, if you go run and tell daddy that Keith hurt your feelings or whatever, you're going to forgive him in an hour. And you're going to be like, oh, he can't do no wrong. Yeah. Your daddy is not going to like him for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
He's going to dig in. That's just what parents do. They side with their own.
Yeah.
And so it's just it's a fatal error. And hopefully, if people get good premarital counseling, they're coached on that. Mm-hmm. So that's one level of it, right? But the other is, again, like, there's things. It's so good for spouses to have healthy communication, but it's also good for spouses to have someone that's the same sex, that's a good friend, that every once in a while they can talk to. And this doesn't mean like, you run off and bash your spouse with this person, but you just have someone safe you can talk with.
Yeah.
And so really good for us.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, just the increase in isolation and also the decrease in just deeper friendships might be contributing to, mental health crisis that a lot of us are in. And even just that, that stigma behind, sharing your problems with other people. Like, I think that it can all play. So I would say it would be a better scenario if you had a plethora of people, not like
for sure.
Yeah. But I'm saying more than one person that you're sharing openly about struggles and getting help in that way.
And you could even broaden this too. This isn't just for spouses, but I remember, my wife and I, we went to a marriage conference one time, and one of the phrases that stuck was like, everything you say, every deed you do either moves you towards oneness or isolation. Like, there is no middle ground. It will do one of those two. And so same thing, let's say you're not married and you're single, but like if you find yourself getting isolated, beware, because that's how the devil hunts.
Yeah.
Like, he wants to isolate you. I mean, look at a good safari show sometime. What do those lions do? Do they take on the biggest, baddest hippo? Nope. They go after that little hippo. They try to pull him away from the herd. Same thing with any other animal out there, right? Yep. Because they're going for easy prey. And that's what the devil wants to do. Yep. He will try to isolate you. So if you recognize that, it's time to get in some community.
Yeah, definitely. Which, I mean, even as we're filming this tonight, you have another outpost.
Yeah.
And it's a community for
veterans of any gender, age, and then we have law enforcement, firemen, and EMS. And we spend 2 hours together. I come prepared to lead a devotion. And, I have several questions. I got my cheesy icebreaker question to warm them up, just because I'm a youth pastor. I can't help it. And then we have some pretty heartfelt ones. But in the end, if we have an outsider show up, which I'm always hopeful that we do, we all know to shift gears and care for that person. But it's just a safe place to talk. And we've seen such value. We've been doing it for a few months now. And to see just men and women open up, and then to see how others come alongside them and care for them. Yeah. A lot of times I don't have to facilitate anything. I can just get out of the way and watch one brother tighten up another brother if he needs to be tightened up. we had one. Yeah, I actually won't share any of the things that go on because a lot of them are too near and dear, and they might actually be listening to this podcast. But a lot of beautiful things have happened, and it just reinforced in my heart that this was needed.
Yeah, need for others. Yeah,
yeah.
So crucial. Well, you have a survival tip for us today about wildlife awareness.
Very much so. So, picture a scenario, you're in the wild and you're going, I'm going to do a survival shelter, and you find this beautiful cave, and you're just like, I'm going to go back there and call it a night. And you don't explore it all. You don't get your flashlight. You just carve it out there. And the beautiful cave happens to have someone else living in it. Now, it could be a slithery thing that, is small but poisonous, or it could be a really big furry thing that could eat you, right? And so that's one example, but it's also wildlife awareness. I've seen too many people do foolish things where they just blindly stick their hand under a log. Like in Alaska, it's beautiful because there's no snakes in the entire state. 0. So you can lift your hand under a log and lift things up and not think something's going to bite you, right? But in most places in the world, it's really foolish to just stick your hand blindly into something. And so a good survival tip, because if you're in a survival situation, the last thing you want to do is add on to the stress by being injured by a wild animal. The other thing that I don't think people think about is when they do set up their shelter, a lot of times they're lazy and they want to park it by a water source. Well, you're not the only one that needs water. So again, if you park it right by a water source and you happen to park it right off the side of a trail, you might have company in the middle of the night, especially if you gathered some food and it smells good and you actually cook something. Now that big furry thing that lived in the cave, he's going for a drink of water. And now he's like, you know what? I found something even more delicious to eat.
A tent burrito.
Yeah. So wildlife awareness, we could spend a lot of time talking about all the different scenarios, but it's just so smart to be aware. And then really, let's go even smaller. I've seen people build little survival hooches, where there was an underground yellow jacket nest, things like that. And then they wake up and they just get lit up. And so there's just all these different examples of how wildlife can really jack you up. Yeah. So you want to pay attention and you want to take your time before you park it for the night.
Yeah. Excellent stuff. Well, that concludes another episode of The Warrior's Walk. If you are watching this on YouTube, the vast majority of people that see our content and view our podcast do not actually subscribe to our channel. So if you're watching this, do us a favor, hit subscribe so you won't miss a further episode. And if you're listening to this, feel free to share our content with anybody else that might benefit from it. It's the biggest compliment that you can give us. And we'll see you next time on The Warrior's Walk.